sectionalism characterized the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Each region was distinctive, with its own political, economic, and social interests. In the north, the harsh winters and rocky land discouraged large-scale planting. Men turned to the sea for their livelihoods. Industry early made great strides. By 1860, the North had more than 80% of the nation's factories and over 70% of its railroads.
Bridges build, stations make, lay the track the trains will take.
The industrial North wanted duties or tariffs placed on imported goods to give their own products a competitive advantage. But the South, whose economy depended on foreign trade, could only be hurt by trade restrictions. After Congress raised tariffs in 1828 and again in 1832, South Carolina passed an ordinance nullifying the tariff laws and threatened to secede from the Union if an attempt was made to enforce them. In the North, South Carolina's nullification of a federal law was characterized as treason and as a first step toward civil war. President Andrew Jackson, although a Southerner and a states' rights advocate, moved swiftly against South Carolina, spurred by his conviction that the federal union must be preserved. Union became a sacred principle.
May God save the Union, the red, white, and blue. Our states keep united, one nation, not two.
Union was defended with eloquence by Henry Clay and by Daniel Webster, who thrilled the country with his words, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." But even as political leaders like Webster and Clay were working for union, events and conditions were working against it. Particularly the continuing existence of slavery in the southern states.
Come all you true friends of the nation, attend to humanity's call.
During the 19th century, many reform groups became increasingly concerned about human rights, and anti-slavery sentiment mounted.
Come aid in the slave's liberation and roll on the Liberty Ball.
Still, the first issue of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, shocked many people with the vehemence of its anti-slavery position. Its publisher, William Lloyd Garrison, attacked what he called the conspiracy of silence that was protecting slavery in the United States. He wrote, "I will be as harsh as the truth." Many considered Garrison's words inflammatory. He and his fellow abolitionists encountered strong opposition even in the North. Abolitionist meetings were disrupted by riots. Printing presses were destroyed. But the abolitionist movement continued to gain ground, attracting the support of such respected literary notables as Longfellow, Thoreau, Hawthorne, and Emerson.
Hear the cry through the nation, freedom's called emancipation.
Especially influential was the former slave, Frederick Douglass, who had escaped to the North in 1838. A popular lecturer and publisher of his own newspaper, Douglass told Northerners, "To me, the American slave trade is a terrible reality." When a child, I watched from the wharves the slave ships, anchored from the shore, with their cargoes of human flesh. In the deep, still darkness of midnight, I have often been aroused by the dead, heavy footsteps of the chained gangs that passed our door.
He had a long chain on. He had a long chain on.
By 1840, the abolitionist movement had about 150,000 followers. Abolitionists repeatedly called upon Congress for action, but their protests were opposed by many political leaders, Northern and Southern, provoking the passage of the gag rule, which provided that the House of Representatives automatically lay aside all petitions relating to the abolition of slavery. This suppression of free speech within the halls of the Capitol shocked thousands of Northerners who now feared that the price of conciliating the South might be the surrender of basic constitutional rights. Southerners were powerful in Washington. They had a majority on the Supreme Court and often influenced Congress far more than their numbers warranted. In addition, Southerners were trying to increase their representation in Congress by annexing to the United States the new Lone Star Republic of Texas, even though it was a move that Mexico, which still claimed Texas, said would mean war. President John Tyler, a Southerner, pushed through the annexation of Texas 3 days before the expiration of his term. The resulting war with Mexico was extremely unpopular in the Northeast. Its opponents saw the war as a plot to expand the area where slavery would be allowed. Many anti-slavery people even pledged not to aid the government. Indeed, after the war, the issue of slavery in the territory acquired from Mexico proved sticky. A crisis came when California applied for statehood in December 1849, threatening the balance that existed between the Union's 30 states, 15 slave and 15 free. But after heated debate, Henry Clay, supported by Daniel Webster and Stephen Douglas, pushed through Congress the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state, left the status of the newly formed Utah and New Mexico territories to be decided by their settlers, abolished slave trade in the District of Columbia, and provided a stronger fugitive slave law. This strict new fugitive slave law, mandating the capture and return of runaway slaves, provoked indignation throughout the North.
Run, slave, run, you better get away.
Northern feeling intensified as Southern slave owners came north to recapture their runaway slaves.
Run, slave, run, your masters are coming.
Even free blacks in the North were often kidnapped by slave catchers.
Run, slave, run, you better get away.
Indignant crowds tried to rescue blacks from jail cells and courtrooms, and in some instances people were killed. This was the climate in 1852, when Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin burst upon the scene, depicting the horrors of slavery. The book, which sold 5,000 copies its first week and over 270,000 copies its first year, had tremendous impact. Now more and more Northerners offered their services to the Underground Railroad, a chain of hiding places for slaves escaping north to freedom. The songs of the Underground Railroad told slaves in their own language how to escape bondage. That they should look to the northern sky, at the Big Dipper, the drinking gourd.
The river bank will make a mighty good road. The dead trees will show you the way. The old man is a-waiting to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd.
Harriet Tubman was outstanding among the blacks in the Underground Railroad movement. After escaping from the South herself, she returned some 300 times to lead other slaves to freedom. Free blacks in the North, like Martin Delany, were virtually unanimous in their demand for immediate abolition. They were supported by the most uncompromising white abolitionists, such as Wendell Phillips, while more moderate abolitionists like Theodore Weld wanted gradual emancipation, with compensation to slave owners for their loss of property. But the thought that abolition would bring into their midst even more free blacks from the South caused other Northerners to vigorously oppose any emancipation. In the North, the trend of opinion finally centered upon anti-slavery rather than abolition, a feeling that slavery was wrong, that the monster of slavery should not be pulled into the territories, but that there should be no interference with slavery where it already existed. Slavery outside the states was a continuing problem, and the organization of the vast Kansas and Nebraska territories provoked a bitter controversy. Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a bill which would have allowed slavery in Kansas and Nebraska, providing the settlers approved. Douglas's Nebraska bill aroused enormous opposition throughout the North.
Oh, brothers, come, brothers, hasten all with me. We'll sing out in Nebraska, not of slaves, but liberty.
The controversy brought into the political spotlight former Congressman Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, who graphically pinpointed the Nebraska bill's weakness. He predicted that it would bring violence to the territories. And indeed, the nightmares of bleeding Kansas began shortly after the bill was passed. Armed pro-slavery men attempted to block all routes to the territory, confiscating guns and supplies. Settlers lived in constant fear of attacks. The destruction of Lawrence, Kansas by a pro-slavery mob triggered a terrible guerrilla war. Anti-slavery, or free soil men, continually clashed with slavery men. In the Northeast, a Save Kansas movement began, with emigrant aid companies recruiting and arming settlers. Soon the free soil settlers far outnumbered the pro-slavery people in Kansas. But voting for delegates to the Kansas Constitutional Convention was rigged by pro-slavery forces. And pro-slavery Missourians crossed the border to stuff the ballot boxes. As a result, a constitution permitting slavery was drawn up. And slave state status was about to be forced down the throat of an area that was overwhelmingly anti-slavery. So aroused was Northern opinion, both in and out of Congress, that a compromise was finally worked out. Kansas was permitted to postpone a decision on its constitution by deferring statehood. Emotions over these issues ran high, so high that even respectable politicians became violent. Many congressmen began attending sessions armed. In one startling incident, a South Carolina representative beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts unconscious, injuring him so severely that he could not return to the Senate for 3 years. Northern outrage over these events was heightened further by a decision handed down in the case of Dred Scott, a slave who had sued for his freedom after his master took him north. Under Chief Justice Taney of Maryland, the Supreme Court ruled that a black, born of a slave, could not be a citizen, had no rights, and could sue no one.
Nobody knows that I am a man. Nobody knows but me.
These emotion-charged issues were aired in the Lincoln-Douglas debates during the 1858 senatorial campaign in Illinois. Although Lincoln lost his bid for the United States Senate, he gained national fame with his keen analysis of difficult issues. Lincoln's opinions were clear. and most Northerners found themselves agreeing with him. They agreed when Lincoln denounced the 1859 raid against the little Virginia town of Harper's Ferry, conducted by the abolitionist John Brown in an unsuccessful attempt to free the slaves. Several people were killed, and Lincoln declared that violence was wrong, even for a just cause. A minority, however, did not agree with Lincoln. They saw Brown as a hero.
John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave. He sounded forth the trumpet calling freedom for the slave.
To many, the courage Brown displayed at his trial and his eloquent prison interviews and letters were deeply moving. Poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow mourned, "Even as I write, they are leading old John Brown to execution in Virginia for attempting to rescue slaves."
They hung him for a traitor, they themselves the traitor crew, but his truth goes marching on.
Everything came to a head with the election of 1860. At its national convention, the new Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president.
Arise, arise, Republicans, bear the banner of the free, to where the star of union lights us on to victory.
Virtually all the southern states were opposed to the Republican Party. Many were prepared to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected. Lincoln was elected, and South Carolina was the first state to secede, followed by Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, who was to remain in office 4 more months, was tormented by pressures from all sides. He thought that the southern states were committing illegal acts by seceding, but believed that he had no power to stop them. President-elect Lincoln, on the other hand, refused to recognize or tolerate secession. He saw it as a first step toward a continent of many nations fighting over boundary lines and fugitive slaves. Lincoln felt that Americans must patch up their differences and remain a united people. At his inauguration in March 1861, Lincoln declared that as far as he was concerned, the Union was unbroken. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one, to preserve, protect, and defend it. We must not be enemies. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.